Good day, friends. Welcome to our part 6. Today we will be exploring together the Persian Bayán's Váḥid 7 or Book 7, and then there will be some questions at the end. This is going to be in 2 parts. Book 7, or the 7th Váḥid, is one of the shorter books of the Bayán Farsi. In the Tam edition, it starts on page 238 and ends on page 272, making it about 34 pages in length, with each page consisting of 19 handwritten lines. In the Nicolas French translation, Book 7 is 62 pages long, which takes up about 1/3 of volume 4 of Le Bayán Persan. Unfortunately, only 6 excerpts from this Váḥid have been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, and they're namely from chapters 2, 9, 13, and 15, and 19. However, between myself and Dr. Saidi, in his book Gate of the Heart, we will present to you additional translations, provisional translations, which hopefully enhances your understanding of some of the contents of this magnificent book of the Persian Bayán. So we begin with chapter 1. The essence of the first chapter of book 7 is about renewal and break with the past. The chapter begins with these words: on the renewal of all books after 202 years have elapsed since their composition, and the destruction of what hath been written in the past, or bestowal of them upon someone else. The substance of this gate or chapter is that in every revelation, God desireth to re-establish a new divine rose garden. It is for this reason that he hath ordained that once every 202 years, every soul must renew whatever he or she possesseth in books, either by disposing of them in fresh water or gifting them to someone else, so that no one's eye may behold a word that could cause him to be averted from the truth. For every word that is written, I found that very fascinating, 70,000 angels are its advocate. So a very interesting concept. It's about renewal, as I said earlier. So the Bab basically says after about 200 years, all the old books have to be discarded, or re-gifted, if you will, or gifted to others. And or in its destruction, he talks about putting them in water, basically because they were handwritten with ink, that the ink would wash it away, and basically it will go back to nature again. So this is it's a very fascinating law. Now, again, these are all, as we have seen, these laws are really preparatory for the advent of him whom God shall make manifest. So by introducing this law, the Bab is refocusing the individual believer to the new commandments of the Bayán and taking them away from the old. And this, and with the other law of the destruction of books, which again has been abrogated in the revelation of Bahá'u'lláh. These were again there to reconfigure the minds of people to the new, and take them away from the old. Again, as with almost all the chapters of the Bayán Farsi, the underlying theme of this first chapter of Book 7 is preparation for the recognition of him whom God shall make manifest. Addressing his followers, the Bab states that after the revelation of him whom God shall make manifest, no other book should be written or transcribed or printed except his book. For transcribing a single letter of his works is more superior than the transcription of the entire Bayán. We've seen this before, we're going to hear it again. The Bab completely subordinates his own revelation to that of him whom God shall make manifest. And anything, any of the laws, the harsh ones or the benign ones, if you will, they are all contingent on the acceptance of him whom God shall make manifest. At the end of this chapter, the Bab also praises the virtues of the printing industry, for according to him, it will serve to promote and disseminate the words and verses of him whom God shall make manifest. Unfortunately, no parts of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, nor any parts of it has been discussed by Dr. Saidi in his book. So we're going to suffice to what I have just presented here as far as the summary of this chapter. The chapter itself is a medium size, consists of about 40 handwritten lines in the original language. Moving on to chapter 2. Chapter 2, the Bab continues to elaborate on the concept of lillah, or for God, which he first introduced in chapter 7 of book 6, while discussing the law of marriage. In The Gate of the Heart, Dr. Saidi provides an extensive explanation of the Bab's approach to this new divine concept. Saidi writes, the Bab's most direct discussion of the philosophy of ethical action in the Persian Bayán is found in his explanations of the concept of lillah, which means for God, abiding by the will of God or acting for the sake of God, and which refers to the inner motivation of action. This motive of action is the same as contentment with the divine good pleasure and attaining true annihilation of the self before God. Saidi further adds in Gate 2 of book 7, entitled On the Motive of Action, the Bab creates a symbolic law to convey this principle. He then goes on to quote several excerpts from this chapter, starting with the opening lines of chapter 2. And these are the opening lines of the second Bab of the seventh Váḥid. The substance of this gate or chapter, the Bab states, is that no behavior turneth into a real action unless it is performed for the sake of God. It is for this reason that it is enjoined upon all those who perform any act to utter these words at the time of their action. Verily, I do this for God, the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the Lord of all that is seen and unseen, the Lord of creation. Should he recite them in his heart, his action would be rewarded as a result. The Bab continues, however, no act will become for God unless the one who performeth the act recognizes the tree of truth, the manifestation, which is the manifestation of God. And then he goes on, it is not appropriate that anyone perform an act for someone unless he doeth it for the sake of God. And it will not be for God unless it is for the sake of the revelation of that time. And the Bab continues, in like manner, the people who are now acting in accordance with the Bayán and recite this verse, should they in the day of the revelation of him whom God shall make manifest perform action for him, they act for the sake of God. Otherwise, their action will come to naught, as if they had not done anything. After quoting the previous passage from chapter 2, Dr. Saidi writes, here the Bab is affirming that Baha'u'lláh, or rather what Baha'u'lláh states at the beginning of the Kitab Aqdas, that the goodness of deeds is inseparable from the recognition of the manifestation of God. In explaining this logic, the Bab says that since the new manifestation is the previous manifestation himself, any act that is not done for the new manifestation is not done for the previous manifestation either. The Bab continues by writing in the second chapter, the secret of this mystery is this, that from the day of Adam, the one who was followed by the faithful was none other than the apostle of God, and all the revealed books, not but the very Quran that was sent down unto him. This menteth that in truth they have been veiled from the previous revelation and his book, inasmuch as they have failed to recognize him as the same previous manifestation who is now manifested in the next revelation. Chapter 2 consists of about 42 handwritten lines in the original language. The last third of this chapter has been fortunately translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, and these are the excerpts from those translated passages. The Bab writes, at the time of the appearance of him whom God shall make manifest, wert thou to perform thy deeds for the sake of the point of the Bayán, they would be regarded as performed for one other than God, inasmuch as on that day the point of the Bayán is none other than him whom God shall make manifest. And the Bab continues, it is for this reason that at the beginning of every dispensation, a vast multitude who fondly imagine that their deeds are for God become drowned and ungodly, and perceive this not, except such as he guideth as at his behest. It is better for a man, the Bab continues, to guide a soul than to possess all that lies between east and west. Likewise, better is guidance for him who is guided than all the things that exist on earth, for by reason of this guidance he will, after his death, gain admittance into paradise, whereas by reason of the things of the world below, he will, after his death, receive his deserts. Hence God desireth, again, I'll have to read to see that what that the word is at the end. Again, these are whether it's a misquote or something. Hence God desireth that all men should be guided aright through the potency of the word of him whom God shall make manifest. This notion that the greatest achievement of every human being is to really guide another human being is also echoed in the writings of Baha'u'lláh as well.
The word there would be deserts, Sharoch. He gets what he deserves, in other words.
So he deserts. So it is correct?
He receives his deserts. In other words, he receives what he deserves to receive because...
Deserts. Okay. All right. Thank you for adding that. I thought maybe it was a misquote. So yeah, receive his deserts. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. For a moment, I just thought it was out of context there. Okay. So however, such as are conceited will not suffer themselves to be guided. They will be debarred from the truth, some by reason of their learning, others on account of their glory and power, and still others due to reasons of their own, none of which shall be of any avail at the hour of death. The Bab then continues and says, take thou good heed that ye may all, under the leadership of him who is the source of divine guidance, be enabled to direct thy steps aright upon the bridge. This is that sirat, that bridge, which is sharper than the sword and finer than a hair, so that perchance the things which from the beginning of thy life till the end thou hast performed for the love of God may not all at once and unrealized by thyself be turned to acts not acceptable in the sight of God. Verily, God guideth whom he will into the path of absolute certitude. Now, there was a question early on by one of the students about this reference to this, the bridge of Sarat, which we talked about in previous chapters, which the Bab makes reference, and then this particular reference, which is sharper than the sword and finer than a hair. So what that basically means, I guess symbolically, that one has to, and you have to traverse, you have to walk in this. So it basically says it's a very tedious thing that one has to be very careful because it can cut, and it's also so thin that you can fall off of it, meaning that you have to remain very focused to the guidance and the commandments of God in order to be able to traverse this mystical bridge, this bridge that is only a select few who have come to recognize the manifestation of God, who are doing God's will, are able to traverse, who are able to scale, if you will, and again, towards their path to heaven. So again, the symbolism of that, the sword, sharper than the sword and finer than the hair, is what I understand from that. With only 10 handwritten lines in the original language, chapter 3 is the shortest chapter of book 7. It is entitled on that it is binding upon everyone to repay their debts in an expeditious manner. So this is very interesting. The Bab talks about paying one's debt. The chapter begins with these words. The substance of this gate or chapter is that lending money to a believer hath always been and shall ever be praiseworthy in the sight of God. However, the repayment of debt, which is binding on everyone, is also beloved before God. So the Bab essentially says that God wishes that the people lend each other money, whether it's in business or personal transaction, but he says, but it's also very important. It's part of an individual's honor to be able to repay that debt, as expeditiously as possible, and to repay it and not basically default on it and not pay that. So it is again a counsel for both the lender and the recipient of the loan, if you will. The Bab continues. He states, the fruit of this ordinance is this, that the divine words of glorification, celebration of praise, sanctification, exaltation of unity and magnification, and all other parts of religion are tokens that are bestowed as a bounty from the supreme truth unto his created beings. Therefore, upon his revelation, it is incumbent upon all to return this bounteous loan unto him, from the lofty word of the declaration of the divine unity to the last token of limitation, where one to repay at once upon the revelation his debt, nothing would be reduced from his possessions, rather he would be acknowledged in both the world and within himself. So this debt, this repayment here is also symbolic. It's not just the material, but is the spiritual. And I believe it goes back to the greater covenant that God has made with humanity, which Baha'u'lláh expounds on in his writings, that he will, as part of his love for his creatures, his covenant with his creatures, God the Creator sends his manifestations to guide his people from time to time, from cycle to cycle. And as such, in return, that debt that we owe as creatures is to recognize and to accept the manifestation of God and his laws and to do his bidding. So therefore, this is where I believe that the symbolism, where the Bab talks both on the material side of things, the material debt that has to be repaid, also the spiritual debt has to be repaid as well. In chapter 4, the Bab introduces a new ritual which he calls takhlis, which can be translated into English as self-purification from sin. It was to be practiced once every 19 days by each believer. Now, since this practice has not been reaffirmed in the Baha'i revelation, and no parts of this chapter has been discussed or translated into English by either Dr. Saidi in his book or by the Baha'i World Center, we shall also forego any further explanation of the contents of this gate. From a scholarly point of view, it's kind of very interesting that what the Bab is talking about, and there's a ritual, there's a verse that you have to repeat, this once every 19 days, and so on. The chapter itself is rather short. It only consists of about 19 handwritten lines in the original language. Chapter 5 begins with these words: in the day, and this is my translation, in the day of the manifestation of the tree of truth, it is unlawful for anyone to adhere to any previous revelation which he hath been an adherent of. And once he heareth of the new revelation, let him present himself before its manifestation, that he may command him to do what he willeth. The Bab goes on to say the substance of this gate or chapter is that which is the cause of every soul's salvation is the recognition of the new revelation, and so is true for the opposite of this. So if you don't, then you won't have salvation. Essentially, that's what he's saying. What constitutes the religion of God, the Bab continues, in every divine revelation is the laws and ordinances that are revealed through the person of God's chosen manifestation. So that gives you a kind of an idea of the theme, the major theme of that chapter. The chapter itself is rather short, but very significant and profound, as we saw, with about 10 and a half lines in the original. It is the second shortest chapter of book 7. Unfortunately, no parts of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, nor any parts of it have been discussed by Dr. Saidi in his book. Moving on to chapter 6. In chapter 6, the Bab issues an injunction forbidding anyone from carrying on their person any instruments of war, such as guns or any types of weapon that can bring harm to another person. This injunction has also been reconfirmed by Baha'u'lláh in the Kitab al-Aqdas in almost verbatim. I found that to be almost identical. The chapter begins with these words: on that it is not permissible to possess arms or instruments of war unless it is absolutely essential, or at the time of a religious war, or in the case of those who build such weapons of war. So he says, في عدم جواز أخذ أسباب الحرب وآلاتها إلا في حين الضرورة أو وقت المجاهدة إلا الذين هم يصنعون. This is the part that's in Arabic, which is the exordium of this chapter. Now, similarly, in the Kitab al-Aqdas, we read this: it has been forbidden you to carry arms unless essential. حرم عليكم حمل آلات الحرب إلا حين الضرورة. So this is Baha'u'lláh. So you can see it's It's very similar, especially those who read Persian or Arabic, particularly Arabic. You will see that they're both they talk about that unless it's essential, unless illa hina darura, and both the Bab use that phrase, which we say in Persian zarurat, but in Arabic is darura. So the Bab continues in chapter 6 of book 7, and he says the substance of this gate, and this one is in Persian, is that any instrument that can become the cause of consternation for anyone by someone else is not acceptable before God, except on those occasions when permission is granted by the manifestation of God, or in the case of those whose professional livelihood is to build such instruments. So for example, if you worked in a factory which built, armaments, it is not forbidden that for you, let's say if you were an engineer or a technician that had a job, in building. I mean, obviously, I think as Baha'is nowadays, we will choose where we would want to work. Both the Bab and Bahá'u'lláh have not forbidden anyone to let's say work for a weapons factory, but even though most of us will probably feel very uncomfortable, working, knowing that what we are building can be used as a source of destruction and misery for others, which generally those weapons are used in the various wars that are going on and conflicts around the world, if you will. Now, in this section, I found this very fascinating. I had read this previously, and this is where the Bab continues on this theme. He says, furthermore, wearing any type of clothing that could bring fear to someone else is not acceptable in this revelation. Even wearing a clothing. And I really, this is my own personal commentary. This obviously, brings back for many of us in the West, the concept of Halloween and people dressing up. Now, again, you can dress up as various characters, but some of the darker side of it, where people dress up in fearful costumes, if you will, the Bab says that you should not be wearing any type of clothing that will bring fear to someone else, and this is not acceptable. Now, although Baha'u'lláh is silenced on this, he talks about again not bringing any kind of sadness or harm to someone. So I believe this is one of those laws that is still very valid, in my personal opinion. Now, again, we may have to ask the House of Justice for clarification, but I don't believe this law has been abrogated by Baha'u'lláh. In fact, I believe the fact that the Baha'u'lláh has not directly abrogated it, nor has made comments about it in a direct way, means that it's still valid. So and it makes common sense as well that one should not be using or costumes or anything, any type of thing that can become a cause of disturbance, apprehension, fear to someone else, which is a form of misbehavior, if you will, towards someone else, because it's obviously is removing their comfort level and making them uncomfortable. In the same way that we're not supposed to make others uncomfortable, this is an extension of that, I believe. Now, the Bab goes on to add, it would be virtuous of any believer who shows diligence in making sure that his or her actions never provokes fear in anyone. So this is, again, he reinforces that it would be virtuous of any believer who shows diligence, meaning an effort to make sure that his or her actions never provokes fear in anyone, advertently or inadvertently even. The Báb says that. Now, with about 29 lines in the original language, chapter 6 is among the medium-sized chapters of book 7. Unfortunately, no parts of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, nor any parts of it have been discussed by Dr. Saidi in his book. Moving on to chapter 7. Although chapter 7 begins with these words, it behooveth whomsoever recognizeth him whom God shall make manifest to supplicate from him his abounding grace, and should he desireth, he will honor him even with the dust of his shoes. The Báb gets into a brief but rather abstruse commentary involving the tree of truth and the mystery of truth, which is beyond our summary analysis. So again, the theme starts with him whom God shall make manifest. Again, this chapter focuses the individuals to seek the presence of him whom God shall make manifest. But then, like many of the other chapters, the Báb gets into this very elegant and yet very deep commentary about some of the facets related to him whom God shall make manifest, the divine revelation, and the various symbolism of that, which again is beyond our discussion right now. Unfortunately, no parts of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, nor parts of it have been discussed by Dr. Saidi in his book. This is a rather short chapter with about 15 lines in the original. It's among the shorter chapters of book 7. Moving on to chapter 8. The theme of chapter 8 is rather abstruse and mystical. In this chapter, the Báb ordains that every believer should write within each month, which is 19 days, 19 times 19 names of God. So that's 361 names of God, as this would remind the believer that all things are created by the primal point and that nothing can be seen in anyone except the revelation of the power of him whom God shall make manifest. Obviously, this injunction, or not this law, this commandment, has not been reinstated by Baha'u'lláh. But again, this is something, as you can see, was meant to prepare the believers in the imminent advent of him whom God shall make manifest. The chapter consists of about 25 handwritten lines in the original language, but no parts of it have been translated into English by either the Baha'i World Center or Dr. Saidi in his book. Moving on to chapter 9. In chapter 9, the Báb issues a command to any king who would come to embrace his cause. He writes, the substance of this gate is that should any king embraceth the cause of the Bayán, it would be praiseworthy for him to build 2 special houses, one in the name of him whom God shall make manifest, and the other in his own name. The number of the doors of the first house should not exceed 95 in number, and for the second house, its door should not surpass the number 90. Now, it's very fascinating. I did not mention this, but because this was in the previous book, book 6, there's a section where the Báb talks about, when he was talking about various shrines, he talks about his own house and the house that would be built, or he actually says his house, his own house, his sacred house. Now, we know the house of the Báb was destroyed in 1979, but it has to be built again, rebuilt again. So I believe that the Báb anticipated that his house will be destroyed at some point and a new house will be built. Now, it's very interesting that in that chapter, he also says that his house, the number of doors of his house should not exceed 95 in number. And this is the same for him whom God shall make manifest as well. So him whom God shall make manifest and him are at the same level. You can see that. And this again all goes back to the statement by Bahá'u'lláh and even the Báb. You will see that he says that at the time of the advent of him whom God shall make manifest, that would be his re-revelation, if you will, or reinstatement of the Báb, the point of the Bayán, Nuqta-e-Ula, as well. So, they are the same. And Baha'u'lláh says that the reality of the Báb and his reality are the same. So here, there's another indication that him whom God shall make manifest and the Báb, even if there would be special houses for each of them, they will be very similar, that their doors would not exceed 95. And then the door of the house of the king, whom Baha'u'lláh has says is the shadow of God on earth, is a lesser. It should not surpass 90 as a symbol that even the king, the most powerful ruler of the land, is still inferior to God's manifestation, and shows a humility towards the creator as well. The Báb then gets into a long exposition on the significance of this command as related to the advent of him whom God shall make manifest, which again is beyond our discussion. Now, towards the end of this chapter, while addressing the entire company of his followers, he writes the following, and this has been translated by the Baha'i World Center. He writes, "O people of the Bayán, be on your guard, for on the day of resurrection, no one shall find a place to flee to. He will shine forth suddenly and will pronounce judgment as he pleaseth. If it be his wish, he will cause the abased to be exalted, and the exalted to be abased, even as he did in the Bayán, couldst thou but understand. And no one but him is equal unto this. Whatever he ordaineth will be fulfilled, and nothing will remain unfulfilled." Unfortunately, no other parts of this chapter have been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, nor any sections of it have been discussed by Dr. Saidi in his book. With 56 handwritten lines in the original language, chapter 9 is the third longest chapter of book 7. Moving on to chapter 10. In chapter 10, the Báb introduces and expounds on the mystical concept of mustaghas. Many of you may have heard this phrase mustaghas, and this is related to the appearance of him whom God shall make manifest. The term mustaghas literally means he whose aid is invoked, and it's which essentially is God. And the word has a numerical value of 2001. Now, without getting into a deep explanation of its multi-layered meaning, it ultimately refers to him whom God shall make manifest and the year of his appearance. The best explanation of mustaghas, even in Dr. Saidi's book, there goes into a very brief paragraph of that, and he says that it's beyond the scope of his book even to get into the concept of mustaghas, which is very mystical, very deep. The best explanation that I have seen, or best attempted explaining it, because we don't know, neither The Guardian or I believe Abdul Baha have really expounded on this. I believe that Baha'u'lláh may have covered a portions of this or made references of it in his Kitab al-Badi, but it is not something that is very easily and readily available. Now, this concept of mustaghas, the arch enemy of Baha'u'lláh, Mirza Yahya Subh Azal, and his followers have used the misinterpretation of mustaghas as a way of denouncing the validity of Baha'u'llah's revelation, maintaining that he could not be him whom God shall make manifest, as the advent of that promised one is destined for much later years than 9 and 19. So they have completely misunderstood Mustaghas. Now, the best explanation, as I was saying, to finish my thought, is Dr. Nusratullah Muhammad Husseini in his book, The Bab. He covers that a lot more in depth than anywhere I have seen, both in English and in Persian. But again, the concept is it's really not, as urgent for understanding, because there are other very direct references by the Bab in his writings in the Bayán about the advent of him whom God shall make manifest. So this notion of Mustaghas has become a cause of test, especially for the Azalis and for some of the Babis who are decided to follow Azal and follow his misguided interpretation of this concept, this reference, this mystical reference, in the Bayán. Unfortunately, no parts of this chapter have been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center. No, any sections of it have been discussed by Dr. Saidi in his book. So chapter 10 consists of about 26 handwritten lines in the original language. So this ends part 1 of book 7.